Okay, hello everybody. We're back to the map, and for good reason. I don't know how you guys feel about these particular videos that I throw in here. Some people just like the experiential work, which I can understand, because of a few things, right, that we've talked about here when I've had the map up. Like it regulates your nervous system, whether you call it that or not, to sit in meditation or to be with a teacher. Um, it feels good. There can be states of realization or even temporary shifts. It's important to know that because that can be part of the reason why we don't like the conceptual stuff is repression. Just says no, because we're getting the nervous system regulation out of the experiential stuff, and we might not be getting to the root of suffering either, right? That's the whole point of the bypass talk is. And so all I'm asking people is to integrate and have a balanced view about things so that there's this place for experiential work, which is like what we do on Sundays. And that's Sundays at 5 p.m. Pacific is my mostly live teaching on YouTube, free every Sunday. But we just have to remember, and you have to see where you fall. I mean, are you someone who you only like the conceptual stuff? I've had to look at this in myself because well, my second type is 5 on the Enneagram, which means can be analytical. My first type is peacemaker, buried anger. So I was drawn to, well, I was an attorney, so I was drawn to the conceptual because that kept me out of my body. So you can imagine the struggle or the process I've been in to embody presence and then still be able to teach because when you go into the body, well, my ability to think and articulate has helped me as a teacher. But when you go into the body, you have to drop all of that conceptual knowledge, including, I mean, all the way down to the word awareness and everything else for me to actually be awake, especially embodied. And so, yeah, these things right here can get in the way of that if you're the kind of person like I used to be, which I'd be drawn to just the intellectual stuff, but I don't want to feel anything or rest as awareness or anything like that. But then there's the flip side of the spectrum where I just want I just want to rest. I like the experiential stuff and I don't like the conceptual stuff. But most of the time it's driven by avoidance or repression. This is just how you stay safe from what you've buried, but your conscious mind would tell you something different entirely. It might tell you that Scott Killaby is two in his head, for example, like shadow it out to me. Or I just like Scott's teaching on Sunday nights so much because it's experiential, and I prefer experiential teachers. And we don't see the identification and all that or where it comes from. And it's a process, self-compassion to see where this comes from. But if you think about it, it's what Ken Wilber is saying, speaking of having teachers and listening to what they're saying, he's a teacher of mine. And he told me through a book a long time ago that as he researched all the spiritual traditions, they were always one part experiential and one part conceptual. And when I worked with Greg Good, again, I've told you another teacher of mine, he really helped me understand the importance of context. In fact, nobody, they both really did a good job as teachers of helping me with that. And they both also were really good in their own ways. And Ken, I didn't work with personally, except for on the phone, talking to him one day and some email. But Greg was an ongoing, mostly email and some in-person relationship. But what they both helped me with more than any other teacher or teachers is this notion of, is there an objective reality? In other words, can anyone see what really is? And, you would think, well, if you're a non-dual teacher, you know the answer. Yes, but it wasn't embodied, the presence. So I was still needing a teacher. I was in the embodiment process, and they helped me in so many ways to see experientially that and to say there's no objective reality is not the objective reality either. It's just to say that what we take to be out there isn't out there. It is what our consciousness projects. for us to see. And in science or evolutionary research, they would say, well, we're not experiencing reality. We're only experiencing what we need to experience to survive and procreate. And they call those fitness payoffs. In evolutionary research, Donald Hoffman talks about that. And here in KI, we talk about utilities essentially being very similar or the same thing as fitness payoffs on the emotional level, meaning you're always being run by that conditioning. I have to stay safe and get love. Right. And so the conceptual framework that I created, just so that you know, is held very lightly. It's only to illuminate what's driving the suffering, if you notice. So I'm not in my head with this stuff. I'm actually embodied. But and when I went into the body to try to teach it, I couldn't just point to awareness because that was the bypass. That's the first dimension bypass. So I had to come up with a new way, and we did, Dan, me, Toshi, others, of communicating this. And we want to say right off the bat, and I do on this video, that this is not the truth. So in order to do KI, you can't land on KI is the only way. I mean, you can, but then that's just another form of suffering. And all forms of suffering are treated equally here, including if somebody was bonded to me as a teacher and they were really enjoying that. But in some way, if that was a source of suffering, that would be something that the person will look at. And that's what really being radical with it is. So when we talk about teachings and conceptual frameworks and context, we do have to be careful, as Ken says, to make sure that we don't mistake the map for the territory. But that's just it's just a pointer, what he's saying. What I would say is, here's what we've done in KI before I start this second dimension talk. What we've done is we've created a context that serves a purpose. It's like a functional context or a functional spiritual teaching in that it points to what you are. It's what I do on YouTube here, to the presence, but then it points you in how that will be a bypass if that's all you do, and it points you very directly to that and eventually into the embodiment process through these kinds of documents that show you the bypass. So this is so much a part of the practice because if you just sat there in awareness in first dimension, as I've said before, you would just sit there bypassing, but you wouldn't know how or why because the repression is unconsciously creating all that. But now that you listen to these videos, when you're sitting in meditation or awareness, you have a different consciousness. It's more informed with regard to how we're run on safety, for example. And so your practice is shaped by that, which means the reason that we put these concepts into the world is just to make our practice more skillful and effective so that freedom can happen. The concepts here are all about the experiential. They might sound like they're conceptual until you do KI, especially 3D inquiry. And then you'll see that there's nothing to hang on here to. This is all empty too. These are just pointers. The freedom is experiential. And there's no objective reality, and we're not pointing to it either. Just so you know, that's one thing about KI. And this whole dimensional map is a way of saying we've already embodied that insight here, that we know there's no objective reality, and that mostly in spiritual teachings, there are just these thorns that are there to remove the thorns of suffering. Some of those thorns, we have reason to identify with them because we have trauma. So I might identify with my teaching if that keeps me safe from the buried hurt or anger. But if I deal with my buried hurt or anger, I don't have to identify even with my own teaching. And that would be suffering anyway. So let that be a model for how you hold KI, and that it's okay at first to either love or hate it. But ultimately, that's all you because there's no objective reality, meaning your trauma and repression is interfacing with us constantly. And that's what you're seeing when you hear us. You're never seeing reality. You're seeing what you need to see to stay safe and get love. But that's all unconscious. And that's here in the third dimension that we won't be talking about directly. But what I will do is illuminate here on YouTube both the benefits in first and second dimension, excuse me, and the limitations. And today we're talking about second dimension. So this piggybacks off of the experiential Sunday night event we just had, where I said, hey, be looking for this video. And here it is. And we're going to talk about second dimension. So kick back. I don't have a ton of time, so I'm not going to do this for, expect it like at the most like 30 minutes. Can't keep to that. I want you to take a moment, as I do every time I bring up this map with you all, to just, I'm going to stop here and I want you to read everything in second dimension on the left and the right. And then understand that those red lines there represent the fear that we hold deep in our bodies, that we work with in third dimension, the buried stuff. And that fear is running into second dimension. And that's all I want you to know right now. There's fear running throughout your experience, and it's running into this second dimension of practice, creating a bypass. Once you read these lists, I'll come back and explain that. Remember that repression runs the spiritual practice in first and second dimension, or until we make that repression conscious, it runs the practice whether we're aware of it or not. And to debate me on that is okay. I don't mind that, but I'd rather take you into inquiry and show it to you. And that's what we do with KI, is show you it. But it's good to get a start in the mind and, you know, understanding that we come to spirituality for nervous system regulation. And then we're going to talk about some things that could trigger you. And, of course, people like the awareness meditation talks. And sometimes they don't like these because these feel threatening towards certain practices or teachings that we follow. But I want you to remember before I start here that KI includes all relationship, because you see, life is relationship. So if we were to leave your relationship with a practice or a path out of the practice here, there wouldn't be KI. It would be bypassing here. That's how I left my old teaching behind and embodied the presence, is I had to let go of things that were creating harm, in a sense, by teaching me not to get to the unconscious. And then at the conscious level, I told myself things. So I told myself things to keep me safe from what was buried. You're doing the same thing, whether you realize it or not. Maybe there's people out there that aren't, who've done a lot of deep work at the third dimension level, but this is a trigger warning always, because we're criticizing or critiquing our own practices and how we seek safety when we think we're seeking freedom. Okay, so now that I did that second dimension talk the other night, and you saw the benefits of it. I mean, maybe if you didn't get the skill down, it was triggering in and of itself, or I don't know what your experience was. Well, but that was second dimension inquiry. And if you noticed, I don't talk like this on those Sunday evenings because I'm doing inquiry and we're pointing together, looking. And the reason that is because I want to take the time afterwards and explain to you how the things that we were doing are a bypass, even though I didn't mention it every time. But see, because now this starts to shape how you look at what you're doing and becoming more conscious of how the repression drives things. And that's what leads you deeper into inquiry, when you really see what's going on. So in second dimension, well, do you remember the first video where I said, here are the benefits of first dimension? And we talked about all that. And we talked about the limitations. Sorry. We got up the map and I mentioned the benefits of meditation and mindfulness in first dimension right here. But, we talked about the benefit and then the limitations. In order to what? To make you not meditate? No. To make you not recognize awareness? No. No, that's the benefit. We're showing you the limitations so you'll see the bypass and correct it. We're not doing it to trigger. So the second dimension is the same thing. We're showing you the benefit. I showed it to you the other night. I've invited you to do second dimension inquiry in your life. You're seeing the benefit. If you're not, you're probably not doing it skillfully enough, and I want to help you with that. And just remember that my teaching, is the way I see it, is my retreat center or is YouTube, it's social media, because it's 2024. And it just dawned on me that that's the way I want to teach, because there are people sitting in their room right now watching this and don't have anyone. And there's a lot of avoidant attachment style, anger repressors and hurt repressors who won't reach out for help because of the repression keeping them safe. And those people, I know that feeling, that isolation. And if you're not going to have a teacher or a mentor right now because of the avoidant pattern, at least you can sit with me and learn about how your own practice that you're doing at home by yourself without any teacher or anyone watching you, that avoidant pattern comes from repression, and that's your bypass there. Just like the person who keeps going back to the teacher and can't stand in their own experience, more anxious attachment, it's both the sabotage when it comes to ending suffering, because trauma runs everything, and therefore that pattern is running this. So I'm doing this for those people who need some work on catching themselves. So when you do second dimension inquiry, you don't really catch the bypass when you're doing it, right? I mean, maybe you do if you've done enough third dimension work and you've gone deeper into the body, then you might see it. But if you just come to like a second dimension teaching, like you just came here the other night and you liked the inquiries, but you've never done inquiry, or you've done a little bit, and maybe now you want to explore second dimension, you wouldn't do, or you wouldn't notice the bypass when you're doing it because it's repression. And so I want to explain it to you. Because there's a bypass that's unique in second dimension, it's unique to that dimension and different than first. So second dimension, when we prompt something up, for example, do you remember me talking about and using mining? I may or may not have named it, but that's a technique that's on the right side there. It's part of our KI, second dimension KI. You can see that there. Mining is when you just sitting and being, and there's like a contraction in the stomach or in the throat or something. And as you feel all the way into it, it doesn't produce any information. And so you say, what does this energy or sensation mean about me? And then something comes up. And that's then again that universal definition of awakening, that something that was there connected to that energy, some program or story comes up, and now it's an object in awareness, and you're sitting there looking at it. And maybe some more things come, and maybe you sit there and you ask the question a few times because it's opening that area a little bit. What else does this throat sensation want to say, or what does it mean? And then more things come into awareness, letting all those things be, just like we've done together. Well, right there, if you look at that in isolation, that looks like and is actually a skillful practice. But you know where I'm going with this. I'm going to show you the bypass in it, but first I want to show you why it looks like a skillful practice. It's not with regard from the perspective of third dimension inquiry. It's a bypass. But when you first do second dimension, it's an opening to something, because you're not aware of yet directly what's driving your suffering if you haven't done that deep body work that we do in 3D. And so you're just seeing something for the first time. And I don't want to rob people of the experience of the insights in these dimensions, because it's beautiful to, like, when you feel down into the stomach and you say, well, what does this mean about me? And here comes like just an image of dad, and like, I'm a loser. And you don't have to think about it or do anything with it, which is the beauty of awareness practices. Just let that be. You see how simple that is still? And people like it for that reason. And more than that, it's actually skillful because it, again, speaking of the universal mechanism, her definition of awakening, something that was unconscious, loser, was prompted up by a second dimension practice into awareness. You see that as an object of awareness, and then it falls away and you see that you're not that. And what I say is bullshit on the universal definition. And I'll tell you why, and I think a lot of teachers would agree with me, embodiment teachers, that the definition needs an upgrade. Because when that loser identity falls away, there might be a seeing sort of in the moment that you're not that thought and feeling, but the body keeps the score no matter what spiritual teachers or others in spirituality say. And it seems to be that science is like our link to this if we don't get it, but we don't need it. If we trust ourselves more and become skillful, we'll see this that, okay, the one thing I want to tell you right off the bat that will make you understand that that particular skill is a bypass is that it doesn't matter how you change the form of that question. Pretty much, it doesn't matter. That the repression that's buried deep will not arise in response to that inquiry. And it took me, well, gosh, did it really? It took me about a year and a half to truly see it because I sat there with intense pain and I was mining that, and thoughts and images, even old memories would come up. And yeah, I would get some relief, but never did the pain go away or really substantially change. So after a year and a half of just first and second dimension work with that pain, which just means being and doing nothing with it, letting it be exactly as it is, first dimension. And then second dimension, letting it be as it is and prompting things up. So I did that, and that was helpful to the extent that that probably kept me out of the emergency room and helped to manage the pain and regulate my system. There's that nervous system regulation thing again. But it didn't get to the root of the pain, which was the emotional repression. Why? Because our systems bury those emotions, and that programming that buries them is part of the whole unconsciousness of that is that it doesn't arise, that it all is outside of awareness. So in awareness-based practices, it's not going to arise. And so I've experimented with it in second dimension, and I developed it into third dimension because it doesn't want to arise, the repression. So in third dimension, we get it to finally arise. But in second dimension, so that you see the bypass, it's it's there every day of your life. When you're in first and second dimension practice of being, you're just living in the bypass. And there could be so much ego in it that self-protects, like just shunning things that might help you, real things like KI. I've seen it too. In other words, people sitting there mining over and over and over again, like I did, convinced that they're going to end suffering, like I did. And I'm telling you, it's not going to happen, most likely. There's going to be that fluke situation, like Adya says, rare in a generation, but someone just does a practice or something and boom. But for the vast majority, you can sit there and mine all day, and I've watched it for years, and the repression conditioning doesn't come up. So the mining does two things. It regulates your system, which is what the mechanism of repression wants. So it strengthens the, or at least maintains the suffering mechanism. Second dimension inquiry does. It's a bypass. And then also, though, it does make you, and this is a good thing, you become more conscious. It's the universal definition. Because if I've got the loser program, you know, somehow in my stomach, and I prompt that up into awareness, that's not something that would have otherwise come up for whatever reason. Well, we know why, actually, is that even these identities and these things that we see in second dimension, like I'm a loser, if you look at the left here, and any kind of separate self identity is there for a reason. And we only learn that in third dimension because the reason is buried. But these identities come up, and this is such a big part of the non-dual bypass right here on identity. See, because we don't include the understanding often in non-duality that we have developed, the consciousness develops. It's not just a blanket or blank awareness that we just recognize or not. There's this development process in which when we were kids, we had to identify with that to stay safe and to make sure that mom and dad love us, right? So in other words, we couldn't feel and express what was true for us. fully, we had to bury some things. There's third dimension. There's science. There's your body. We had to bury some emotions just to survive our parents and our childhood. So here we are as adults, and many of us doing second dimension inquiry. And we don't realize that we developed it for safety, that at some level we chose that, but you can't say it consciously chose it. But we couldn't have survived, apparently, without that part of our development here in this conscious world, or this unconscious world at least. If we lived in a really conscious world, our development might be different. But in this world, we have unconscious parents. So the way that we develop is that we have to believe these stories and identities about ourselves. We can't be our authentic self, whatever that is. And that's where non-duality comes in. Who are you? What are you? But if there's a bypass, it can't be answered and experienced fully. And what happens in non-duality is these identities come up. And so it can't be embodied, the presence, when we're just focusing on, although non-duality's focus on identity is right. We all know that. But we have to get to the repression that created those identities from childhood, right? We had to hold anger back and be a good boy identity. And now and as an adult, if I have to be good still because I have repression, then you're going to say something or do something and I'm going to feel bad. And that identity comes up. Why? Because I have emotional repression and I can't feel and express anger. So that creates that duality. Repression creates the duality. Don't believe me. You have to do the work to see. Third dimension work to see that. But you can start to become aware of this now and correct the bypass so that when identities come up, you're going to do something here eventually very different with those when you do third dimension. But you don't have to rush to third dimension. See, because everyone should explore these dimensions for as long as they need to experience the benefits and the limitations, right? Unless you've just suffered enough and then go to third dimension. If you're, I mean, seriously, I don't want to stop you from that either. You have autonomy and free agency. And as a teacher, I need to be very direct at what I think works and whether you agree or not, that's up to you. But I need to be direct. But also, I want to provide this really open space for everybody to just come at the place where they are. And even if I'm direct with you, it's just to help you see what I've seen to become more skillful. It's not to push you. I have no urgency around you awakening to awareness or even embodying it, because that urgency would come from repression. What you are experiencing is just enthusiasm. Look, the thing to remember about non-duality, especially, and identity is very simple. Identity comes from emotional repression. You can't know that until you do 3D, but I am a teacher who's telling you that. Why? So you'll trust me? No, because I'm not a teacher who thinks that you should believe me. I'm someone who thinks that the only way to freedom is through direct experience, and through inquiry, you'll see it. I want to show you how, and I want to tell you. And that's so different. That's how I'm mentoring these days. This is inquiry. This is direct experience, investigation. You have a right to discover insights on your own and to not be taught by teachers what the truth is. And instead, I want to give you skills that allow you to trust yourself and discover these beautiful and rich insights for yourself, because they are life changing. And I would not steal that from you. But what I will do is point you to how, if you don't catch the bypass, you don't get the really rich insights, the deep realization. You don't have to do KI, but don't you want the freedom, right? This is a way to it. And I say that to all the people out there. The reason I'm saying that is because there's so many people, and I love you all, who are interested in awakening. I devoted my life to waking up. I totally get it. This is a non-dual path. Don't bamboozle yourself around that. What we're doing is we're starting with the body, because the body keeps the score. And we were kids, we just couldn't feel and express everything, and we had to believe that we were not good enough. And if you understand that, then you know what you're doing in non-duality. You're not just recognizing the awareness behind it all. There's a function, a mechanism that's happening that's producing that for safety for you from the repression. And I'm giving you that context so that you won't go down a path that steals you or robs you, I should say, of the insights that are available from embodying presence, from actually embodying it. I would never want to do that to anyone. And I'm willing to teach so you won't. So on this issue of identity is, I mean, I've told you what to look for, but what do you do in practice? You know, do I sit here? Scott Killaby has said Sunday night that here's how you look at identity. And then he sends out a video that says, well, if you sit there and look at identity, you're bypassing the buried emotions. Touche. I don't have a lot of responses to that, frankly. And what I won't do as a teacher is suggest that you should do a lot of questioning identity, because what that does, it's like pulling up the flowers or the weeds, but you've got roots in the ground, and that's going to keep coming. So I'm not going to say just question, I'm not good enough, or the I thought, or whatever that weed is, or even the I thought, whatever you think it is, because it's actually body, it's mind and body. That's that identification. And when we start to question, I almost don't want to say this, when we start to question identity in first or second dimension with teachers in different ways, we don't even know yet what our real identification is. I didn't, at least. What do you think your main identification is? Like, what do you resist and hold on to and then kind of identify with the most? So right off the bat, I'll tell you, if you're answering from your mind, that's probably not it. That's what's safe. See, I've learned to trust my body and to use skills to tell me those things. But here's what I discovered after years of being not only a non-dual teacher and writing 7 books about what you really are, but having not fully embodied it, and then having a mindfulness training program, LI, Living Inquiries, which focused a lot on identity and therefore a bypass. I know for myself 1,000% that I would never, ever, ever do that for myself, because that's how I think I got sick. And this is what I want to talk to you about, non-duality right here, is there's a lot of teachers who get sick, have pain, and other things that science says are coming, among other things, from repression. And I think what we've discovered here, but I want you to verify it, because we don't have science on it yet, studying the bypass, is that, again, I think it was a lot of repression throughout history, as Ken Wilber has alluded to, Buddhists and other teachers who had repression, who created practices and inquiry that was investigated, but was safe and would never access the buried stuff. And they didn't know any better because it was buried and there wasn't science yet. So I understand that. But I'm lucky to have lived in an age, and you do too, when all the science is here now. So what does that mean? It means that emotional repression drives our suffering, not ego identity. Now, you might say, well, isn't it the same thing? Or you might not. But I did, because I do inquiry, and it wasn't an intellectual thing for me. It was like, what is that? What's the answer to that in direct experience? Because that's the only thing I can trust. I can't really trust a bunch of teachers over here that say ego identity or whatever that is is the root of it all. Or I can't really even trust science completely. I mean, it's helped me tremendously, and I suggest you guys read about the emotional repression and trauma science. But they can't land there because it doesn't give us the freedom. I had to explore for myself, where is this identity? Where's the suffering coming from? And is it coming from ego identity or, like science says, emotional repression? And I found science was correct. And to the extent that teachers are saying something other than science, I disagree with them. In my direct experience, I've seen something different. That if we call ego emotional repression, then I'm on board. But what we do is we bamboozle ourselves with spiritual concepts that aren't grounded in our actual experience at the unconscious level. So at the unconscious level, it's just, I'm afraid, I'm angry, but I'm afraid of it, or I'm hurt, but I can't express it. I'm afraid to get hurt, and that's it. It's like a mechanism that just runs and it keeps you safe by producing suffering in your awareness that you might see come up with second dimension inquiry, like identity. But see, that's just safer. It's the repression creating that to keep you safe. So not good enough comes up. And I was showing you how to process that the other night, or something like that, identity, deficiency story. And so that's the curiosity, isn't it? Because look, the whole thing is a bypass because the emotions are buried. We're resting as awareness, but here comes this identity, and it's just more conscious than the buried emotions, and so it gets our attention, especially since we're in the business of discovering what I really am. So here comes the identity, and it's only natural that we become interested in processing it because it's safer than what's buried. And I noticed when I started teaching in with the third dimension work, people, even though I said, like the science, emotional repression creates our suffering. If you investigate emotional repression, you can end the suffering and the identities will go away because the repression creates it. There were people who just didn't want to hear it. And it wasn't just because they were with teachers who kept saying that for years, that it's ego, but it's because it's just safer to investigate what I'm going to call ego here than it is to feel, well, process, feel, express what's true, including what we've buried. I mean, that's obvious, isn't it? I don't know. It is for me. So once you know this, you only know it with your mind, really. So when we sit together on Sunday nights, gosh, I hope you remember it, even if I don't bring it up, because I don't want to lead you into a bypass or a habit of just questioning identity. So real quick, what do I mean by that? It's deficiency story. Like, I'm not good enough. I'm unlovable. I'm a victim. There's something wrong with me. Some sense of lack or deficiency. And remember, what we've seen here is that sense of deficiency is real in the sense that we are deficient. We've buried these emotions. So it creates this sense that something is missing. And then the mind gets a hold of it, and then, oh, identity. But if you go back, it just makes sense. You couldn't express hurt. So your identity after that was, I'm tough, or I have to be big because you can't be vulnerable. And when you think about it that way, it just makes it more human. It does for me. And so we learn first in our minds and on journaling. So here's my next point. I've invited you guys to do everyday utility journaling. And this is how you're going to see the bypass in second dimension. This is utility journaling, and second dimension just can open you up to getting to the root of suffering, even if your system has been resisting what we're doing in 3D. And by the way, there is a way to do 3D work in 2D, but it's rather arduous. And if somebody is really hell-bent on it, you can ask a question around it. But I can't say too much because the more that we resist the repression work, I just see that it's so natural that we're trying to find an end run around the very thing that we don't want to feel. And we'll try everything to do that, including every technique possible that doesn't get to it, but that gets to something else that's safer. So when I'm doing that inquiry with you, I don't always say, hey, we're looking at these identities, but this is a bypass. But because I've said it now, it becomes, I think, your responsibility as someone who's following this work, not to just listen to this and forget it, but to integrate this. So I've been inviting you guys to do utility journaling. I know that not everybody is doing it. That's part of the reason that I suggested it, to show you how sabotage happens. So for those of you who are not doing a utility journal by now, or who won't, if you foresee yourself not doing it. And by the way, this video is going a little bit longer because I had more to say. But if you don't do utility journaling, it's okay. There's no slap on the wrist. It's an opportunity. If you speak up, we can talk about why you don't, because utility journaling starts to open you up to the bypass in the practice that you're doing, unless you're also sabotaging the practice. Some of you will experience that. You, instead of doing the practice but not doing the journal, some of you will do the journal and not the practice. Some of you will do none of it. We can learn and work with all of that if you're open. If you continue to not take one step towards even processing why you don't journal or why you don't process, because there's inquiry that you can do around that. I'll show it to you. Ask me. Then you see how we're sabotaging ourselves. Taking one step, and that one step that I'm asking you to take is to start utility journaling. Even if you don't do it every day, do it as often as possible. And to remind you what it is, it's any recurring forms of suffering. You want to write them down. And so this is why I brought it up, is second dimension has this very recurring identity that we start to be able to bring up in awareness with inquiry, because it wouldn't arise in first dimension. And I have direct experience with this. The I'm unlovable core story that I had never came into awareness itself. And even when I woke up, so I have so much freedom in the non-dual experience, but the I'm unlovable core story had been really just a somatic thing. Like I just felt unlovable my whole life. When I had the awakening experience, because there was a heart opening, a lot of that just fell away. The I'm unlovable. But because it was tied to anger repression, it went to other places, and including the spine and the chronic pain, because it was anger repression. So I'm just saying that these particular identities that we find in second dimension inquiry, the reason that we do second dimension inquiry is because these identities are also often buried, but not as buried as the emotions that are buried in that we find in third dimension. So it's almost like there's a hierarchy of safety, as you can see, developing for humans. And we just mapped out our version of that. The hierarchy is that, well, the stuff that's the scariest is here, the emotions that we buried, and that drives our suffering that comes up here. Well, first in first dimension, meaning just in awareness, we see our shadows and our triggers and all that, right? And but that's all safer than what's buried. It's a hierarchy of safety that we're not even conscious to because we're in a bypass. But then, frankly, all this stuff in the first dimension, when we're sitting in awareness, is also safer than the stuff that we prompt up in second dimension, which just means this in my experience. I didn't have to deal with the unlovable thing in first dimension as a teacher. I was bypassing. And so were a lot of other teachers who I interviewed later. And I said, do you have a sense of deficiency or insufficiency or unworthiness in your body anywhere? And most everyone that I talked to said yes. And some even talked about it as teachers. Very popular teachers talked about it. But the question is, are we bypassing in the conversation about this core story if we even talk about it? Because many teachings don't refer to it. Because it's in the body, they'll just say, well, that's a sensation. Let that be an awareness. But it's a sensation that makes me feel like I'm unlovable, you know? So I'll let that be. But then I just live with this sense that I'm unlovable. That's not really non-dual. Just because there's no thoughts appearing in the moment, there's still this feeling of I'm unlovable. And when you ask a teacher about that, they'll sometimes kind of gaslight you because Well, I mean, I did it. Somebody would say, well, this great self-inquiry that you have, Scott, meaning second dimension when I was in a bypass, but that feeling of me is still in the body. And I'd say, well, if you notice though, that's just a thought me. This is totally unskillful. Look at the thought that that's in my body or that that's me, and look at the sensation and see that that's appearing to awareness. It's an object in awareness. But that's where the the method breaks down. That method of just being with what is, that's still a method because there's repression there. And so the method there is keeping something down, whether one knows it or not. So in keeping something down in first dimension teachings and practices, some teachers will encourage students then to bypass that stuff in the body, keep that down, including I'm not good enough. It's a feeling. Can we all admit that? Or am I crazy? It's not an identity in the mind. There are definitely thoughts with it, maybe a lot of them actually. But those are like branches of this tree. And the very core feeling is like, I'm unlovable. Well, when you're sitting in meditation, if it's something in your body, the thought I'm unlovable doesn't arise for many people, even though it's a core identity. For some, it does, especially if you sat in meditation or done inquiry a lot. But for many, it doesn't. And so they too experience a lack of embodiment of awareness because they don't know how to investigate that sense that I'm invalid is in the body or that I'm unheard is in my heart area. And it's not something in the mind to question, really. Okay, so why do we do it then? Why do we sit like we did in second dimension and do reverse inquiry? Like if the identity is I'm unlovable, why do we say I'm lovable to conjure up these thoughts that say I'm unlovable, that try to prove it to me? Why would I do that if, well, first of all, those are just coming because of the buried stuff. But secondly, that this sense of deficiency isn't really thought. If you agree in your experience, it's a felt sense, then why the hell are we sitting there witnessing all these thoughts about identity? Like, I'm not good enough. Well, it's not that easy. For some people, we have to do that to prepare for 3D work, the repression work, because we're just not used to making really unconscious mind-body connections conscious in our spiritual practice. Meaning it just means we have a sense of me in the body, but we don't know what to do with it. That's all it means. It's the same as when I had chronic pain, but I don't know what to do with it. So I just rest with it, just let it be. It's a first dimension blindness because that's a lot of unconsciousness creating that suffering buried in the body, but we just rest and let it be. That's not happening when you have repression. We're never really resting and letting something be that has a lot of contraction with it. For example, there's anger or hurt in there and fear. And a lot of conditioning that says no to that. And that's not letting be. So what we need to do in second dimension, I think the value of second dimension is just making this mind-body connection conscious that we're going to explore even deeper in third dimension to end the suffering. And frankly, if you're ready for making that third dimension mind-body connection conscious, come to our mentorship or the kit, the mentorship discovery kit. And that's at killaby.com, top of the page. I don't want to rob anybody of that, but I want to meet you where you are. And so that's for you that's your experience. But if you're someone who just came and you sat the other night and you're enjoying that reverse inquiry or any of the second dimension inquiries and you're getting a lot of freedom, I don't want to take that from you because that's beautiful. I'll just say there's a bypass in it. And I'm going to explain it as I continue teaching. I think I just did. And I'm going to give you better inquiries. I probably already did. I just want to remind you not to continue to do reverse inquiry on identity forever because that's created by repression and it keeps you safe. And too many teachings and practices focus there, and it's the wrong focus. If you want to end suffering, it's not that ego there. That ego that you can finally make conscious in second dimension is coming from repression. That sense of unlovability was there to keep me safe from the anger that I buried. That's a child development issue, but it's also an awakening issue because it deals with identity. But we have to include the fact that this is how we developed. And it's a bigger context than just rest and let everything be, or prompt some things up and see where that goes. And so, you know what I mean? There's a context here. Okay. So I could say this about all the things there. There's a big bypass in second dimension. There's also benefit. What I would say is the benefit mostly is prompting something up where it's like you say, I am lovable, and here come the thoughts that you can witness that say you aren't, and then you can feel the energy connected to them and just let all that be. And that's good because it's making mind body connection conscious, something that was otherwise unconscious. Remember the universal definition? Then you prompt it up, and then it becomes an object in awareness. And you let that be. Just like Ken Wilber says, but where I disagree is on the definition that says when all that identity stuff has come and gone from that inquiry, you are the awareness that remains. That's true, but it's not embodied. And we don't need to hang on that conceptually because then we just hide from the buried stuff. What I want to say is something different there. I give you a different context. You are awareness, but what good is that if you're suffering? And so if you see something come up, just be with it and let it come and go. Don't add anything like I'm the awareness, or you don't have to constantly remind yourself of the awareness thing, actually. That's what you'll find here. That sometimes our focus on that is just because we have buried emotions. So here's my last point. I probably introduced this the other day, but I'm going to introduce it again for those who didn't see it. Although, remember that I'm asking you guys to watch all the videos in the playlist, free non-duality teaching on YouTube, from beginning to end or in chronological order. And so you probably heard this the other night, but in case anybody didn't or you want to hear it again, these are the inquiries that I suggest in second dimension. And I put a lot of years of experience in working with people to bring this to you. And you could say that these inquiries start to work on repression, which is what you want. You don't want inquiry or resting as awareness in first dimension to be completely blind to the root of suffering. You want to be working with that from the beginning. My recommendation is you do 3D from the beginning. That makes the most sense to me. However, as a teacher, I know that not everybody will do that. So I want to meet you where you are and say, if you're more comfortable with second dimension inquiry, if you're an anger repressor, I'm going to give you an inquiry versus you being a hurt or sadness repressor. I'm going to give you an inquiry. There's two different ones coming here. Before we get to that, you need to know what your primary repression is. So some of you who have been following me here on YouTube and listening to me as a teacher, but you don't understand the context of KI yet, meaning we're correcting a bypass that happens automatically, then what we do here is we take the repression test first because you want to know what's driving your suffering. You want to know what's driving the seeking and the bypass, and it's repression. But you want to know what you repress. What are those emotions? And if you don't, you won't know which inquiry to do here today. So I would say if you haven't taken the repression test, stop the video. If you're enjoying this teaching and you want to get the greatest benefit, stop the video. Because if you don't, you're about to go into a bypass potentially. It's like flipping a coin. And if you flip the coin in the wrong direction, you've just gone to the direction of safety. And that can actually bring up, so if you start to experience ill effects or something like more triggers, you went down the wrong road. You're staying safe. We want to end your suffering just like you do, or I know you do. So take the test, repressiontest.com. And look, it'll put you on the newsletter, but if you don't want to do the 3D work, unsubscribe as soon as it comes. And then you've taken the test and you can come back to YouTube for the free teaching. Because I know that people who aren't ready they just won't come to 3D. So I want to help you here. When you take your test, all that you need to know for this free non-duality teaching is what I'm about to tell you here, which is you're going to choose one of these options. If you've taken the test, we'll go forward here. If you predominantly repress anger, and you should know that from the test, and if you don't, go back to the test or seek out a mentor, because if you don't know what we call your primary repression is, what you actually hold back, and the dominant emotion in that repression. In other words, what do you hold back the most? As you guys know, for me, it was anger, but I also held back joy, power, and other things, femininity. All those things together make up my primary repression in KI. My dominant emotion was anger. Now, everybody has fear. So everybody includes fear. But when you go do that test, it should be fear and at least some other emotion before you start this work. Because if it's just fear, well, that means you're totally okay with anger and hurt and sadness. Be sure that that's true for you. Go take the test. It'll make sense. Okay, so assuming that you've taken it, now I'm going to get you started on some experiential work. And I wasn't going to do this, except that I thought that, look, if you've listened to all this, especially if you didn't show up in the meeting the other night, you don't know where we're going here. And you might start questioning identity. And I actually kind of want to just warn against it, even though other teachers will say do it. And trust this instead. If you're an anger repressor, use this reverse inquiry. You pull up people or someone, you feel fully into the body, and you say, I can say and do what I want. And as you're feeling into the body, just listen, feel, and allow whatever comes up in terms of emotion or sensation, but listen for the thoughts that come up. Even if it's like, no, I can't. Hear and allow that. Hear or see and allow everything that comes up there. So it would be like, pull up my partner. I can say and do what I want. And then there's a contraction for anger repressors, which is the anger repression. But it doesn't feel like anger. See? Because it's buried. It's it's hiding from you. So all you need to do here is start to make the mind-body connection more conscious that says you can't say and do what you want. Just be with that for a moment. I can say and do what I want. And immediately notice the first thought that comes up. Allow it fully in awareness with whatever energy is on it, and letting it be exactly as it is. Remember the universal definition of awakening. Just let that be. And as it falls away, we're not going to say, I'm the awareness that remains. We just let it fall away quietly. And you want to keep doing this in your life every day. You'll see what happens. You'll start to see, first of all, that you're blocked and you don't know why. And you probably didn't realize how much you were. And you can't really be free. But you probably will also realize at some point, since you're following me here, that this is anger repression. But the thing you have to remember is when you're doing this inquiry, the anger won't arise for anger repressors. What arises are safer things like, no, I can't say that. That's safer than anger. See, anything that comes up would be safer than anger, but you're allowing everything that comes up. And this is stuff that's associated with buried anger because it's stopping you from speaking because you might get hurt and get angry. It's stopping you from doing this. It's a sabotage, repression is. So with this, you're really starting to work with sabotage. Like you could say, I can do KI. That's a do what I want. I mean, if you want to do it. And then your body says, no. And the mind, and you just let it all be there. And you're making the mind-body connection conscious, which is a good exercise because as you go into 3D work, you're really going to be doing that much more. So there's your inquiry. And I'm probably going to give much more instruction somewhere else on that if I didn't already last week or last Sunday. That's the instruction. Just do that in your life. If you have questions, This is not an experiential meeting. So at an experiential meeting, ask me questions about that inquiry if you're having difficulty with it, but it's just reverse inquiry. I can say and do what I want, allow it all, one thing at a time. And it's like horizontal, see, one thing after another, one thought after another. And we never go vertical though. See, we're just watching these thoughts, but we don't get into the contraction. Even with this inquiry, you don't get to the anger. So it's only a starter to get you to 3D. Do not think that this inquiry that I just gave you will embody presence, because it most likely won't, but it's going to get you started in that process much more skillfully because you're aimed in the right direction, which is the root of suffering. Everything that you see come up in response to the inquiry, I can say and do what I want, is driven by the repression that says, hold back, stay safe, get love. All unconscious. You're just going to see the stories that come up. Now, for hurt or sadness repressors, for a while I toiled with, what inquiry do I give you? Because, you might have trouble saying and doing what you want, but for you guys, sometimes it's about the suffering in relationship of like losing someone, or feeling like I'm scared to lose someone, or someone dying, and feeling those vulnerable emotions. So a good inquiry for you to really make the mind body connection conscious that's connected to your repression would be pulling someone up and saying, I'm not afraid to lose them, and allowing everything to come and go, and being very thorough about that every day, because you'll see freedom out of that, but not thinking that that will end your suffering. Because those kinds of inquiry in second dimension, remember, they don't pull up the repression. And although your system likes that and wants that, the bypass is chosen by you unconsciously. That's not what you really want. What you really are, that wants freedom, that's not what you want. You don't want to just play it safe in spirituality and just get moments of freedom, even though that's what you'll have here. You want to go to the third dimension where it's the end of the suffering when you see how you're creating it. It's a process, but you see that you're creating it in every moment. And so as you do these inquiries, just remember everything that you see in first or second dimension practice is being created within your own body. And therefore, the world that you see that looks like it's an objective world, when you do these inquiries, you see that the world that you see is actually these thoughts, feelings, and sensations that arise and fall to awareness. And that helps with the non-dual seeing. I'll say more about that later. Thank you for listening.